I'd like to begin back in the book of Genesis. And this pertains to a question that has come up recently. It's a question actually that is asked over the years. It comes up repeatedly, but especially recently it concerns the creation narrative itself, but a part of not just the creation narrative, but an aspect of it. And that we'll make our way to it, but let's begin back on the fourth day of creation. You know, of course, the first 3 days are described here, and then we get to Genesis chapter 1, and beginning in verse 14, we read about the fourth day. It says, "And God said, Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years." Now this expression here, signs and seasons, this could be well translated for appointed times. It's the same terms in the Hebrew used in Leviticus chapter 23 concerning the appointed times or the feast of the Lord. So this text obviously anticipates the arrival of a kind of creature that can actually determine times by a calendar, by the movement of the heavens, by the cycle of the moon, the lunar cycle, by the rising and setting of the sun, and so forth. So some kind of creature here, a creature that's different from the other creatures that you read about in this narrative, will be able to, this anticipates the arrival of this particular kind of being. So that he goes on to describe the fourth day, what he does here on the fourth day, and then he talks about the fifth day, where he makes the sea creatures and the winged birds, and then he goes into the sixth day, and we'll take up the account first of all, he creates the livestock and the creeping things, the beasts of the earth, and so on. Then we take up the account in verse 26. "Then God said, Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." There it is. Very different from any other creature that God had made up to this point. Let us make man in our image after our likeness. So this creature, in some sense, has the likeness of God. "And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens," over the things he's just described that he's created. In other words, who is it that ultimately has dominion? Who has dominion over all creation? It's God himself. So he's saying here is this creature now, this being that bears our image and our likeness, will participate in the dominion that I have, or that we have. That's what he's saying. Man becomes then the co-regent with God. This hints at the very purpose of man's existence. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. The image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. This is more than just a narrative of things that God did. More to it than that. As you see, when you see Jesus commenting, answering questions about, for example, when he answered the question on the permanency of marriage and whether or not a man can divorce his wife for any cause, he refers back to this. So Jesus himself gives us some clue as to how we ought to approach the creation stories. And we see not only the events that took place, we see more than that. We see God's will being expressed through the things that he did. God's will, or his creative actions, will not ever be in conflict with his will, but will come forth from his will. So he made them male and female. He created them, and that's very important, as Jesus says so himself when he's asked the question about the permanency of marriage. It says, "And God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply." You have to have male and female for that. "And fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every creeping thing that moves on the earth." And he goes on to say, "I've given you every green thing as food," and so on. But anyway, he gives man dominion. He creates man, male and female, it says. He creates them. And then we come to, toward the end of that, he says, down in verse 31, says, "And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good." Now, this is something you see repeatedly, and each day he sees it. He sees what he made. It says, "And God said," "and God saw," and then he said, and it says, it was good. Everything that he saw was good. So he looks out over the whole creation, everything that he just made, and he says, "It is very good." And there was evening and there was morning the sixth day. Now that brings us to the key text today. The title of the sermon is The Seventh Day. And here's the text. Chapter 2, verse 1. And believe it or not, this is, there are a multitude of, or several different interpretations of this. We're going to look at one that is popular today, examine it, and see if it really holds water. "Then the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from his work, all his work that he had done." It does not mean that God was tired. Does not mean that we know that God doesn't get tired. We know that he doesn't need to be refreshed. It says in another passage that God rested and was refreshed. How was he refreshed? By delighting in his creation, no doubt. So he was refreshed in that sense. It wasn't that he was recharging his spiritual batteries because he was just slap dab wore out from all that work. That's not what it means at all, of course, and we all know that. I mention that because someone wrote and explained that to me. Okay, it doesn't mean God was tired and all that. That fellow thinks, I guess, that I thought that. I don't know how he got that idea, but I don't think God gets tired. He doesn't slumber. He doesn't sleep. He doesn't need to recharge his spiritual batteries. He is eternal. We understand that, don't we? Well, we all do. Of course we do. So he rested, meaning he ceased on that seventh day from all his work that he had done. So this is the controversial verse, believe it or not. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. When do you suppose he blessed the seventh day? How would you read that? You don't have to answer aloud. I know how you would read it. You would read it to say, well, when he finished his work on the sixth day, then he rested, he ceased, he rested the seventh day, and it says he blessed the seventh day, he declared it holy. You would think, well, he did it right then and right there. No question about it. That's the way it reads, isn't it? Oh, no, we're told. No, you got it wrong. Now, no, I'm not saying that. That's the argument. And it goes like this. You see, Moses wrote this. Moses, maybe some others contributed to it, but Moses is the primary author. And the Sabbath was unknown before the time of Moses. Hold that thought. Let's go over to chapter 16, and this is said to be the origin of the Sabbath. I'm sorry, not Genesis, but Exodus 16. Exodus 16, the claim is that this is when the Sabbath was first known, when it originated, when God gave it. He gave it only to Israel and never to anyone else. Okay? Exodus 16 says, "They set out from Elim," verse 1, "and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt." Now I'm going to read quite a bit of this simply because it tells us something about the people of Israel here, and this is very important as we approach this subject, to understand what kind of people God was dealing with when he brought them out of Egypt, when he brought them into the wilderness, when he gave them his law, and because this does tell us something about a certain category of laws that he gave to them because of their spiritual condition. Now let's continue reading. "And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, and the people of Israel said to them, Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us into the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger." You know, we're better off back there. Why don't we go back to Egypt? At least we had something to eat. Now here we are out in the desert. What are we going to eat? What does this say? What does this say about these people? Were they a people filled with the Spirit of God? Were they people of faith? They trusted God. Now, they had seen the parting of the sea. They had seen all the things God had done in Egypt to get them out of there. They'd seen plenty of miracles, plenty of signs. They knew God was with them. There was the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire and the cloud, and so on. They saw all of these things. And yet here they are saying, well, we're out here in the wilderness and we're going to die. Is that displaying a lot of trust? No, that is the problem. They don't trust God. They don't trust God. That is a very serious problem. So God is going to have to instill some lessons in a people like that. If they were filled with the Spirit of God, you wouldn't have this problem. So they weren't. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them. He's going to put them to the test now. And in putting them to the test, he's going to try to instill some lessons as well, as we shall see, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. This means the sixth day, because the seventh day is going to be a special day. Okay? Let's skip on over to verse 13. Verse 13 says, in the evening quail came down and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? This was the manna that was rained from heaven. For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You shall each take an omer, according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, however, gathered much, whoever gathered much had nothing left over, and whoever gathered little had no lack. In other words, hey, I'm going to get some extra. So we don't know when this stuff's going to run out. So they get some extra and they measure, wait a minute, I only got an omer. And some of them weren't quite able. I guess supposedly they're tired or whatever the case might have been. They didn't, hey, I measured, I got a full omer here. So everybody had the same thing. So here God is showing them. He's going to test them by showing them that he's there with them and he's doing these things for them. And then he'll see how they respond to all of this. And whoever gathered little has no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till morning. There's another little supernatural thing about to go on here. But they did not listen to Moses. There's that condition again, that heart condition they had, spiritual heart condition. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. And then we come to verse 22, and a big test is coming here. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept till the morning. Now wait a minute. Thus far they hadn't been able to do that. When they tried to do it, it stank, as it says in this translation. It rotted, had worms, and it stank. But this time he says, go ahead and prepare it for 2 days' worth, because tomorrow is the Sabbath, and put it up for the morning. No doubt some of them said, oh, that's not going to work. So they laid it aside till the morning. They laid it aside till the morning as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms on it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Now it's claimed that this is the origin of the Sabbath. It begins right here. It was for Israel only, never for any other people. Only Israel. Origin of the Sabbath, end of story. So Genesis 2 is proleptic. It looks forward. It looks forward to the establishment of the Sabbath. And so it was not established back at creation week. That's the argument. We'll test that in a little bit. So eat it today. Today is the Sabbath of the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is a Sabbath, there will be none. Did they trust God? On the seventh day, some of the people went out together. Can you imagine that? All that they've seen thus far, not only everything they'd seen and what God did to get them there, but now then what He's doing here, He causes this stuff that couldn't be kept up for overnight without it having worms and smelling awful. And now then, they can when it comes to the sixth day. And they have enough for the seventh day. And yet, you have some of the people still went out on the seventh day together. And they didn't find anything. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? The you, meaning referring to you people, the people of Israel. See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, He gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one, doesn't mean you have to stay inside the house on the Sabbath. That's not what He's talking about. He said, stay in your place. In other words, don't go out together. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. So they kind of started getting the lesson here. And you see how God had to instill that into them, because this was obviously not an obedient people who were filled with the Spirit of God and who trusted God. The trust wasn't there. It's the same theme you see in the New Testament when the Apostle Paul says, by grace are you saved through faith. They were not a faithful people. They were not exhibiting faith. No trust. It means trust. So the claim is, once again, that the Sabbath was instituted right here, not back in Genesis 2 at the beginning. So and elsewhere we're told that the Sabbath, it was a sign for Israel. We are told that, aren't we? And evidently what those texts mean is that it was a sign of the covenant that God made with Israel. Well, let's go back to Genesis 2 now. One other thing I might mention in going back there, before we take a look at it again and ask some questions, is this. It is also claimed, in support of that theory, that if you look through all the accounts of the historic fathers, Enoch and Abel, for example, the antediluvian people of God, Enoch, Abel, Noah. You look at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, everybody up until the time of Moses, you will not find one single example of anybody keeping the Sabbath. Can you find it? It's not there, is it? Did they keep it? Well, we'll have to see if there's any evidence that possibly they did. We have to admit that it's not there. It's not there, that's for sure. It doesn't tell us. You never read any text anywhere that says, and Jacob rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. It's not there. But there are a lot of things you do find there. But let's look at this text again, chapter 2. Chapter 2. And once again, I'm going to see if this makes sense to you according to that view I've just presented. It says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished His work that He had done. And I'm going to retranslate it, or actually revise it a little bit so you'll get the point on what the argument is. He rested on the seventh day from all His work that He had done. Therefore, in the time of Moses, God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. It's because of what He did back there. In the time of Moses, He blessed it and made it holy. Blessed the seventh day and made it holy. So He did not institute it at creation. He instituted the Sabbath at the time of Moses, because on it God rested from all His work that He had done in creation. Okay. Again, there are no examples of Sabbath keeping among Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, or anybody else before the time of Moses. So what do we do with all of that? What do we do with all of that? And I say, well, first of all, let's look at several scriptures in the Genesis account. In Genesis chapter 4, let's start with that one. Genesis chapter 4, and we want to read the first 5 verses there. It says, "Now Adam knew Eve, his wife," and this is after the fall, after they're driven out of the garden. "And she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground." Now wait a minute here. A keeper of the sheep and a worker of the ground. We don't have anything telling how that came about, do we? They're just driven out of the garden. That's all we know. And then the next thing you know, you got these sheep keepers and ground workers that are already in place. "In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground." Now, where do you get that idea? You see what I'm saying here? All of a sudden, some things are mentioned in passing, and we don't know where in the world they came from. They're just mentioned in passing, and the reader just assumes, well, yeah, that's what they were doing. But we don't have anything on the origin of that. No instructions on how to do it. Nothing. It just, this is what was done. And it's obvious from this account, you could offer in a right way and you could offer in a wrong way. So there must have been some laws connected to it. Mustn't there have been? Yeah. "And Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions." Where do you get those ideas? Just make that up on the spot? No, there's some instructions that have gone on here someplace that we're just not told, are we? My point here is there's a lot in these narratives and these stories that we're not told. These are brief, condensed stories of what happened in the lives of these patriarchs. "And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell." So there you have it. You have this, suddenly this sacrifices, and it says they brought these to the Lord. How do you do that? They must have had some kind of altar or something that represented the presence of God, because there you find God communicating with Cain. With Cain. So they were bringing offerings to God, and you don't have any instructions anywhere on how that got started. So these are all brief accounts. So we can't expect to see everything that they did. Well, let's continue on. We do see a few things that they did, and we see them mentioned incidentally, just in passing, as if the readers expected to understand, oh, that's what they were doing. Go over to chapter 7. A few pages over, chapter 7. First couple of verses there. "And the Lord said to Noah, Go into the ark, and you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals." Whoa, wait a minute. Hold on. What do you mean, clean? You mean the ones that have been washed down real good? No, that's not what it means. "The male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean." You got clean and unclean distinctions right here, and this is still in the time of Noah. The flood hadn't even come yet. Where did they get these ideas? It tells you that Noah knew exactly what the clean and the unclean were. Somebody had told him somewhere along the way. So there had been some instruction that we're not told about. Either that or he just now made it up. I don't think that's the case. So you have these clean and unclean distinctions going on there, and just out of the blue, incidentally, we're told about it, which again illustrates the point that these are condensed stories that do not tell us everything about the lives of the patriarchs. Go to chapter 8. Chapter 8. Verse 20. "Then Noah," this is after the flood, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar." There you go again. An altar. Where'd that come from? One day on the ark, while it's all raining, it couldn't go outside, too rainy, too wet out there. And so he said, "I know what I'll do when I get off this ark. I'm going to build me an altar and offer some sacrifices." Where'd he get the idea? It must have been handed down it must have been revealed somewhere along the way and had become a practice. And it's just recorded here like it's an incidental thing, just telling you what he did. Well, yeah, that's what you expect him to do. He's the patriarch. He offers the sacrifices for the whole family. And so that's what he did. Go over to chapter 14. Chapter 14. And we'll take up the account in verse 17. This is where Abram, before his name was changed to Abraham, met a unique individual, an interesting person called Melchizedek. It says, after his return from the defeat, this is Abraham's return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer, and the kings of which who were with him, the king of Sodom, went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now that's another interesting thing. He just all of a sudden introduced this guy, and you have no idea who he is. Because in the book of Genesis, everybody that's anybody has a genealogy. But here this guy suddenly appears. He's a priest of the Most High God, and we don't know who he is. No genealogy. And the writer of the book of Hebrews will play off of that to develop his theology, or a very important, not just his theology, but a true theology concerning the Melchizedek priesthood, or how it was perceived by the psalmist and how it was related to the messianic identity. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed him. He blessed Abraham, or Abram, and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies in your hand." And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now you might not think anything about that. You say, well, he just decided on a tenth, a tithe. And I would think that if I was just reading along, he gave him a tithe. Okay, he just thought that's a good thing to do. Here's a priest of the Most High God, the God I worship, and so I'm going to give him a tenth in recognition of that as an act of worship toward God. And so you think about that, but you know the problem you get into is when you get over to chapter 28. Chapter 28, you realize that this idea of giving a tenth was not just this one-time notion that Abraham kind of said, well, I know what would give, well, a fifth, nah, a tenth will do it. Because when Jacob realizes that God is working with him the way he is, so he said, we'll just break right into the account. As he says, verse 20, then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way, and that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, if he's going to bless me like he says he's going to bless me, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God, and this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house, and all that you give me I will give a full tenth to you. So you get the idea that this was a practice. This is something they knew to do. Where'd it come from? We could guess about it. We say, well, that was a Near Eastern custom, blah, blah. Well, where'd that come from? The point is, you don't read anything about the origins of these things. These are all incidental. You just read them in the text. There they are. They jump out at you. Say, whoa, you mean they knew about clean and unclean? Oh, they knew about tithing? And things of that nature. The point is, and I'm not trying to make the point, well, are you observing clean and unclean and tithing? Well, that's not my point. My point is that these are condensed stories, and they don't give you the full picture of everything the patriarchs did in their acts of worship and so on. We just have these brief stories of their lives. In fact, you can go through major portions of the scriptures, the Old Testament, during Israel's history, scriptures written during those periods. You can find volumes, much material written that doesn't even mention the Sabbath at all. And yet you know they were keeping the Sabbath, or at least the Sabbath was known. Doesn't even mention it. But is it possible the same thing could be said about the patriarchs? I think it is, especially when you realize how condensed these accounts are. And one other thing I might mention, since we're here in this chapter, in the next chapter, chapter 29, when Jacob, who's madly in love with Rachel, and he's chosen her as his wife. Problem is, that's the younger of the two daughters of Laban, Leah and Rachel. And in that culture, you didn't give the father who owned his children, I guess, didn't give the younger as a bride before he gave the older. Just not the way it was done. But Jacob wanted Rachel as his bride. And so he worked 7 years to get her, and he promised her, the father, Laban, promised her to him. So then completed that, and he goes to, I suppose, her tent, and they are now married, considered married. He goes there, and I don't know how this happened. I don't know how it happened. I don't understand it. When I think through how it might have happened, I always come up with something weird, so I just don't think about it. But he wakes up the next morning and said, "Oh, Leah." It's not Rachel. He said, "You tricked me," to Laban. He said, "No, in our culture we don't do that. You have to take the older first." But I tell you what, you work for me another 7 years, and you can have Rachel too, but go ahead and let her, that's Leah, it says down here in verse 27, complete the week of this one. Go ahead and complete the week of this one. That's some kind of custom we're not told about. What it's talking about is the festivities of a week after, of the marriage, celebrating the marriage. And then after that, he could have Rachel, but he had to work for her for 7 years. He could have her before then, but he was obligated to work for 7 years for Laban. So he tricked him. He pulled a good one on him, and left him with both the daughters. But anyway, the interesting part is it just presupposes that everybody would know what a week is. The week? Where did they get the idea? A week, generally, in Hebrew, if you're thinking Hebrew terms, and this was written by Hebrews and to Hebrews, a week is a 7-day period. It begins with the first day and ends with the seventh day. Do you think maybe this might be a little indicator? It's not proof, not absolute proof, but it could be an indicator that they knew what a week was. Where did they get that idea? Where did they get that idea? Well, could it be that it went back to creation? Very well could. Very well could. But here's another text. I want to go to this one, and this one to me is it says volumes. It's in chapter 26. It concerns Abraham. This is after Abraham had already died, but in chapter 26 he's speaking to Isaac, and in verse 4 God says, "I will multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands, and in your offspring all nations of the earth shall be blessed, because," here it is, "Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge." Now I can understand, he obeyed God when he told him to get up and go to another land. I'll show you, I'm going to give you this as a possession and your descendants after you. He obeyed him when he did that. He said, "Take Isaac your son and take him to the place and offer him as a sacrifice." He was going to do that, so he obeyed God. He kept his charge. He obeyed his voice. But notice how it's worded here. "Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." You look at the life of Abraham, and I can't find enough commandments, statutes, and laws that he kept if I look at everything he did that God said to do. My commandments, my statutes, and my laws. That simply in passing, incidentally, just tells us that there was some kind of divine law, some kind of system of divine law in place in the time of Abraham. Now I ask you, is it unreasonable to think that just maybe Abraham might have been a Sabbath keeper? I think it's very reasonable to think that. Very reasonable. We can't prove it in the sense that you could find a text that says he did. But you do have this text that says he kept God's commandments, his statutes, and his laws. So I would say there's a real good chance that Abraham kept the Sabbath and perhaps even other appointed times. Because as we have seen, they had all kinds of practices and customs in relation to the worship of God that are just mentioned in passing without any reference as to where they came from. So I think we can establish that we can't say for sure, we can't state dogmatically that they were all Sabbath keepers, but I think you can make a very, very strong case that they did know about the Sabbath. Now then, with all that in mind, I want to go over to Matthew chapter 12. We're going to start to look at some scriptures here that in the New Testament that will, as far as I'm concerned, are more, well, they kind of put the cap on it. They're more compelling in answering the question, was the Sabbath day a creation institution or a Mosaic institution? I think we find an answer here, and it's a very strong one. Let's go first of all to Matthew chapter 12. Matthew 12, where we see Jesus being dealt with by the Pharisees concerning the Sabbath day. Chapter 12, verse 1, at that time Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry. This is on the Sabbath. They were out in the grain field. Now, first of all, what were they doing out there? Moving from one location to another, but what were they doing? Just wandering around? No. They were doing the work of God, okay? They were doing God's work. They were moving from one place to another. Happened to be in a grain field. And his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now, you remember the example of the people that went out to gather manna. Now, this has been put to me before. What's the difference between gathering wheat, heads of wheat, or whatever kind of grain it was, and gathering manna? Huh? What about that? And the argument is these people, they were actually breaking the Sabbath. Were they? Is there any difference between this story and the story that we read back in Exodus about the manna? Big difference, big difference. Yeah, huge difference. That story tells you it's completely okay to eat on the Sabbath. I don't think anybody's arguing you can't eat on the Sabbath because it says, take twice as much today so you'll have food for tomorrow. So they were going to be eating manna on the Sabbath. It just says, don't be going out and gathering it, because God was instilling in this hard-hearted people the principle. He wanted to get the pattern, wanted them to get it. So he had to. So here they were, Jesus and the disciples, and they were in a grain field. They were not out there harvesting, were they? They were not farmers, were they? They were not manna gatherers. They're not going out to get their day's supply of food. They were just walking through a grain field and pulled off a few grains and started eating some. Were they in violation of the law? I was told, yes, sir. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. They were breaking God's law. No, there is not one hint from the law that was a sin. Not one. You can't go back to the example of the man picking up sticks. That's another example we could look at. We won't today, but in that example, I'll just mention in passing, in that example, the guy was out gathering sticks on the Sabbath, and they said, what do we do with it? They got him. I guess you could say they arrested him. They took him to Moses. Oh, yeah, it's okay to arrest somebody and take them to the authorities on the Sabbath, but you don't be gathering sticks. That's the way it goes. But anyway, they didn't know what to do with him, because he was doing this. And then Moses didn't know what to do with him either, so that's why he asked God about it. God said, stone him to death. Now, why would God do that? Poor guy was probably, because I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why Moses took the matter to God. Because Moses didn't know what was in that guy's heart. God did. And if you look at that scripture sometime, look at the context, look at the preceding verses, what it's about. It's about intentional and unintentional sins. And it talks about how the individual who commits a sin, he makes a mistake, and it's unintentional. He realizes it's something he shouldn't have done, and he didn't know it at the time, didn't think about it. Then this is the sacrifice he's to bring, and God says, I will forgive him. So what that example is telling you is here was a guy who was deliberately, consciously, knowingly violating what God had told them not to do. That's what he was doing. It was not unintentional. If the guy had the guy been out there not knowing, thinking, oh, you mean I shouldn't be doing this? Been a different matter, been a different outcome. Had he been out there thinking, oh, I got up this morning, I'm thinking all day it was the 6th day, I was getting ready for the Sabbath tomorrow. Come to find out it's the Sabbath. That's actually happened to a few individuals. But then it would have been a different matter. But no, he was sinning, and he knew it. He knew he was doing what he was not supposed to do, fully conscious of that fact. So you can't compare what the disciples here were doing with any of those examples back there. They simply, there was some food right there, readily available, no different from food being on your kitchen table. It was right there. They broke it off, I guess rubbed it in their hands and blew away the inedible portion. I suppose that's how it was done. I guess it's kind of crunchy, but nevertheless they ate. And that's all that went on. Then the Pharisees said, what? Did we read the whole account here? Let's just read on. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. What I wanted to mention about that is that I had told someone that what the disciples were violating was a tradition of the elders. It was not God's law, it was the Pharisees' law. They were in violation of that. And that person said to me, oh, no, they were breaking God's law. You're just reading things in it, you're making things up and adding it to the text. No, it is well known, just read many other texts, well known that there was such a thing as the tradition of the elders. And we know also that the Pharisees, they were the only sect of Judaism that survived the destruction of the temple. The Sadducees didn't survive. The Essenes didn't make it. Well, actually, if you want to call the Messianic Jews a sect of Judaism, they weren't really, but if you want to call them that, they did survive. The Christians, in other words. But the Pharisees they were the only main sect of the Jewish religion of Judaism that survived, and they were the forebears of Rabbinic Judaism, which today you see it in Orthodox Judaism. In about AD 200, the rabbis began thinking that what they called the oral law, what is called in the New Testament the tradition of the elders, needed to be written down. Before then, it was always something they thought should not be done. You have the written law, and then you have the oral law. Now, what is that? Well, it's called the tradition of the elders in the New Testament. The idea was this, that when Moses received the law, the written law, he wrote down what God told him to write down, but then he received other instructions and other explanations because Moses went back to God numerous times to receive more. And he didn't write all that down, but he did communicate it to the elders of Israel, who communicated to teachers after them, who ultimately handed down to the Pharisees. That's why they ensconced themselves in the seat of Moses, claimed to be doctors of the law. Hey, we have the law, not only the written law, we have the tradition of the elders. So yeah, the text doesn't say that specifically, but we know that's in the backdrop. That is the way it was. And the traditions of the elders developed further and were written down then, kept put in what is called the Mishnah, and now you find it in the Talmud. And there are numerous traditions. I think they have, there are like 39 categories of forbidden activities for the Sabbath. I don't know if all 39 were in place in the time of Jesus, but obviously they were moving in that direction. In Rabbinic Judaism, 39 you can't do this, you can't do that. It's like you read the scriptures, man picking up sticks. Let's put that down. Number one, no picking up sticks. Got it. Yeah. Number two, no gathering, because they couldn't gather the manna. Number 3, know this. All these categories of forbidden activities. Eventually, down to our day, no turning on the lights, no doing this, no doing that. What does that amount to? Making the Sabbath a burden. Making it into a burden. That's what it amounts to. And this is what Jesus was dealing with when they accused his disciples of breaking the Sabbath and accusing him for letting them do it when they were doing no such thing. Let me read. I just want to read. This is I'm using the English Standard Version, but this is the Reformation Study Bible. Sometimes it has some interesting notes. They're very interesting when they're dealing with matters pertaining to law and grace. They have some really good stuff. When they're dealing with stuff pertaining to Calvinism, no, I don't like I like their stuff on law and grace. I don't like their stuff on Calvinism. But anyway, this is a very interesting comment here that the author, these are Reformed, remember, Reformed believers, concerning this expression, not lawful. The Pharisees saying it's not lawful for them to do what they're doing on the Sabbath. It says the Old Testament does not prohibit plucking grain on the Sabbath in order to eat. They understand this. The disciples were not farmers engaged in the work of harvest. Very clear, isn't it? The Pharisees' objections were based on an oral tradition that failed to understand the true purpose of the law. And they got it right. That's exactly right. So it was the Pharisees who were not keeping the Sabbath. They weren't keeping it properly. It was the disciples who were the true Sabbath keepers. And someone told me, said, all these Sabbath keepers went after Jesus and the disciples. They were all Sabbath keepers, as if their Sabbath keeping is what made them so bad. All of them were Sabbath keepers. And my response was, no. They were breaking the Sabbath because they're turning it into a burden, something God never intended it to be. The disciples were the true Sabbath keepers here because Jesus understood the intent and purpose of it. Well, let's read on here some other interesting things that he says. He says, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, the showbread, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor those who were with him, but only the priests. That's interesting, isn't it? So what's the point here? What's his message here? You see, some get the idea, say, okay, it was not lawful. Really, that's what the text says. Only the priest was to eat it. But there's some extraordinary circumstances here, and in this case, the priest actually was also in on it. He gave them the bread to eat, David and his men. Who was David? Well, David was God's anointed. He was the king. He was God's anointed. What was he out there doing? Wandering around, watching birds, doing the work that he was on a mission from God. And in the process of David and his men on this mission from God, they became hungry and they ate the bread which was normally not lawful to eat. These were extraordinary circumstances. So they ate of it, and guess what? They weren't condemned for it. His point here is, if they ate the showbread, if God's anointed, there's a little message in there, if the Lord's anointed, that word Messiah means anointed, you understand that. If the Lord's anointed and his men were not condemned for eating the showbread which was not lawful, when the Lord's anointed and his men are not violating God's law by breaking your tradition. That's his point. It's powerful when you think about it. Or have you not read in the law? Now he's going to go right straight to the law here now. How on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath. Do they really? In the temple, the priests profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. Now, wait a minute here. This seems to be a contradiction in terms. If you're profaning the Sabbath, then what you're doing is you're doing something on the Sabbath God has commanded you not to do. So you're profaning the Sabbath. And yet, you're guiltless. What do you mean? Furthermore, God commanded them to do the things they were doing on the Sabbath. So how can they be profaning the Sabbath if God says, this is what I want you to do on the Sabbath? What this actually means is, no, they weren't profaning the Sabbath in God's sight because he ordered them to do it. What it means is that for anyone else, in other words, if you're a butcher and you got your business open doing the very same thing those priests in the temple are doing, then guess what? You are profaning the Sabbath. So under ordinary circumstances, this kind of work they're required to do would be profaning the Sabbath. But guess what? Under these circumstances, i.e., they're acting as priests in the temple, doing what God said to do, they're guiltless. They're blameless. So he's turning the argument back on them. From your point of view, what they did, he says to the Pharisees, what they did, well, they ought to be blamed for it. But they're doing the Lord's work, and they're blameless. And the implication is here, I am the Son of Man. I'm the Messiah. He's not saying that directly, but that's his message. And I'm doing the Lord's work. And my men here, my disciples, are with me, accomplishing that work. And they're hungry and they're eating. And he uses these examples to show that even in extraordinary times, then those things, those physical things that that are found in the law, such as concerning the showbread, well, there are exceptions to that rule. But here, they're not even violating a rule of God by eating the grain. They're violating a rule of the Pharisees. He says, I tell you something greater than the temple is here, he says, talking about himself, of course. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So they had, when it came to the purpose and meaning of the law, they had it all backward. They didn't know. They were deceivers and under deception. The blind leading the blind. And then he says, this is very interesting. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. What in the world does that mean? You could take it and say, well, Son of Man, me, Jesus, I'm Lord of the Sabbath, therefore I can do anything I want to. And my disciples can do anything they want to. Yeah. No, what he means is, again, consider the context. The implied message is this. You Pharisees who have ensconced yourself in the seat of Moses, you Pharisees have made yourselves lords of the Sabbath and therefore lords of the people who keep the Sabbath. You tell them what to do. You bind upon them these heavy burdens. He says the Son of Man is the true Lord of the Sabbath. I'm the one who has authority to interpret it properly. That's what he means. He's the one with the authority, not them. He is that has the authority to interpret it properly. So I think we need to listen to his interpretation of the Sabbath, don't we? His understanding, because no doubt he understood it rightly. And we'll get to, a few moments, we'll get to the question about the Sabbath. Was it a creational institution or a Mosaic institution? But let's go and read this other example, because there's some messages in this that are very important. He went on from there and entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? They're trying to trap him. I mean, can you imagine, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? I suppose according to their ridiculous tradition, it was not lawful. I suppose that if you practiced medicine, gave herbs and ointments and things like that, provided those things, I suppose that those are things you're not supposed to do on the Sabbath. I don't know what's behind it exactly, but nevertheless, they wanted to trap him. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. He said to them, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? In other words, which one of you will not liberate this animal from its suffering? Of how much more value is a man than a sheep? How do you argue with that? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The point here is the liberation aspect. He's about to liberate this man from an infirmity that he's had for a long time. Just as he asked the question, would you liberate that sheep who's suffering in the pit? So it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. So the Sabbath should be understood not as a day of bondage, of days where you got all these rules and regulations and all these things, all these do not, do not, do not, and do not. It's a day of liberation. That's the whole point of it. In fact, why do you think God commanded Israel to rest on that day? Was it just because God doesn't like work? Well, if that's the case, why didn't he have the priest resting and not working on the Sabbath? Is it really about just not work? Is that the whole point? Or is there a reason for not working? Yeah, there's a reason for not working. And the reason for it, he wanted the whole community to shut down, stop their day-to-day chores, their day-to-day jobs and activities. And because here's the key. They wanted them to stop working because he wanted to liberate them from those responsibilities, liberate them to worship him. So when people say the Sabbath is, it's only about a day of rest because people work hard and they need a day of, no, it's not. No, it's not. Not at all. It's about worship. And so God wanted them to stop working so he could liberate them to worship him. It's all about liberation. That's it. So when we break it down and start thinking in terms of do not pick up sticks, do not turn the eye on the stove, do not do this, do not do that, then we begin to make it into a day of something other than liberty. It's a day of liberation. It pictures, it liberates us to worship God. We're here together worshiping God. It's a communal thing as well. We worship him in community. So it liberates us to worship God. He says, stretch out your hand, and the man stretched it out, and it was restored healthy like the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. I guess, can you imagine the discussion? Can you believe what he did in there? He performed a miracle, and that's terrible. I don't know, how do you come up with this kind of? I don't know. But Mark chapter 2 adds something else to this account. It gives us the same account in a brief form, and yet it adds something else I think is very important. And it states essentially what I just told you. And also, I think it answers the question, was the Sabbath a creation institution, or was it a Mosaic institution? Let's look at Mark's account. Mark chapter 2, verse 23, on Sabbath, or one Sabbath, Jesus, was going through the grain fields, the same account. And as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath? And he said to them, have you never read, he says the same thing there, what David did when he was in need and was hungry, and he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, and here's the difference in the account, or one of the differences. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Think about that for a little while. And then he says the same thing again. He says in Matthew's account, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. There are two things here that he talks about that are made. The Sabbath was made. Now it was made either at creation week or it was made in the time of Moses. But there's something else here that was made. It says not man for the Sabbath. Man was made. It says man was not made for the Sabbath. When was man made? In the time of Moses? So what is he talking about here? He's talking about when things were made. This echoes the creation account. That's what it does. Just as when he was asked the question about marriage, he referred back to the creation account in order to restore the original meaning of marriage. Answers the question by restoring what God intended for marriage in the beginning. Even though in the time of Moses there was a law that said if you divorce your wife, give her a certificate of divorce. He said from the beginning it was not God's will. That was his message there. You see it in the creation account. Here, once again, this echoes the creation account. He's no doubt, in my mind, there's no doubt he has the creation account in mind. Because he's talking about when things were made, when the Sabbath was made at creation week. When man was made at creation week. Sixth day, one the sixth day, one the seventh day. And was it made just for God's own benefit? Was God the only one that kept that first Sabbath, or that only Sabbath? Just God rested and nobody else joined him in that rest, whatever that means? That's why I emphasized when we're in Genesis that the emphasis was on man bearing God's image and God's likeness and being in communion with God, even sharing his dominion, being made God's co-regent. So when it says God rested on the seventh day, when he made it holy, and right here I get the impression, yeah, that's when the Sabbath was made, when man was made. He made it holy then, not later in the time of Moses. Why would he do that? For his own good? Was he just saying, oh, he ceased on that day? No. He made it for man, the creature that bears his image and likeness. That's what Jesus is affirming here, in my opinion. And he goes on to say, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. He's already said something greater than the temple is here, talking about himself. And now he says, Son of Man is greater than the Sabbath, or is Lord of the Sabbath. So he's Lord. He's not Lord of something that doesn't exist. I say that too. He's Lord of the Sabbath, meaning he's the one who can properly teach how it's to be kept and what its original purpose was. And that's exactly what he's doing right here. And again, Sabbath was made for man, meaning Sabbath was made to liberate man from his day-to-day routine so he can worship God. That's what it's about. So again, this echoes Genesis chapter 2 in the creation account. And it answers the question, I believe. Did Jesus think the seventh day was made holy in the time of Adam or in the time of Moses? How would you answer that question now? I think it was made holy in the time of Adam, made holy at creation week. And if it was made holy then and not in the time of Moses, then guess what that means so far as who it was made holy for? One other thing I might mention here, in the Greek text here, look it up sometime, you'll see that the definite article is used. It says the Sabbath was made for the man, not the man for the Sabbath. Is there any question in your mind that he's referring back to the creation account? The man. Sabbath was made for the man. The definite article is there. Which man would that be? The first man, I would say. Not just Israel, but for the man. That's the expression that's translated, or should be, is properly translated, the man, actually means either Adam, or it can refer to humanity, all who were in Adam, the whole of the human race. It can refer to that. But I don't see any place where it refers exclusively to Israel. Not there. So then the Sabbath was made for all mankind. That puts it in a whole different category then, doesn't it? Than to say it was established only in the time of Moses, made only for the people of Israel. No, it was made for all mankind, and it did serve as a covenant sign for the people of Israel, but it certainly was not restricted to that function. Not restricted at all. We'll have to take up the story at another time. But in Hebrews chapter 4, we even see that the seventh day symbolizes something that is still in our future. So why would it be abolished and of no use for us if it remains yet to be fulfilled? Oh, it is in one sense fulfilled in Christ, but Christ has more work to do before the meaning of the Sabbath is fully and finally fulfilled. You may have heard the expression, Jesus is my Sabbath. You may have heard that. People who are explaining their reason for not, when you ask them, why you believe in the Ten Commandments? Yeah, why don't you keep the fourth one? Well, Jesus is my Sabbath. They're explaining why they don't observe a day. Well, in one sense, it depends on what you mean by that. If you're using it as an excuse, I don't agree with that, of course, but if you're saying that everything the Sabbath points to, everything it pictures, is fulfilled in Jesus, is provided for us in Jesus, then yeah, I can agree. In one sense, in that sense, Jesus is my Sabbath. From that, though, I conclude, therefore, I don't need any holy day. No. From that I say, therefore, the day itself becomes even more meaningful. And I will worship Him who is Lord of that day with greater intensity and more meaning than anyone could who doesn't know Jesus.